Okay, so I want to talk about this while it's fresh. I've just seen an interview. I would say a segment of an interview, but it was pretty testy, so I think it was the whole interview with the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, short-term Prime Minister, and journalist on Middle East Eye. I'm not really familiar with that network, but apparently the guy worked on Sky News as well. I don't know who the journalist is, but he was asking Bennett about whether or not Israel will allow uh, electricity into the Gaza Strip. Now, before I continue, I make absolutely no caveat here. I support Israel's right to defend itself unequivocally, right? But I think Bennett handled it badly. He got very angry and he just kept interrupting the interviewer, and I think he handled it badly. Now, if I was an Israeli, my emotions would probably be very high at the moment. But I think he missed an opportunity. He could have really used that to talk about the fact that Hamas has completely corrupted Gaza. They have squandered the money that's been sent to them. They've built tunnels that they refuse to allow citizens to use. There's a big question about what Egypt's doing. I mean, it's not widely reported, but Egypt also has a blockade on Gaza. Um, but notwithstanding my sincere support for Israel in terms of its right to defend itself and its right to exist, I won't lie, I am uneasy about the civilian casualties in Gaza. And I do think that Israel's scorched earth tactic here, which it seems to be going for, is a mistake actually from a military perspective, because if they just carpet bomb the place, which they seem to be doing, civilians will definitely die. And I'm well aware that Hamas hides behind them, but civilians will die, and Israel knows that. Um, and it will just make a grim situation even grimmer. Now, I think what's happening is the Netanyahu government, coalition government as it stands, is taking the total war approach. And there is some logic to this. They have faced an unprecedented attack on their soil. I think any nation in the world would be really smarting for revenge in this situation. Certainly after 9/11, that was the sentiments in the United States. And at the height of the Blitz, there was certainly no sense of chivalry among the British public. In fact, Bennett quoted that. He said, you know, when the Allies, well, he quoted Britain, when you bombed Dresden, there was no questions about this because it was total war. Clearly, he was very upset. But I think for a senior politician, it was a missed opportunity. I'm not saying he shouldn't have been emotional, but he just ranted and kept interrupting the journalist. And the journalist was very quick to point out that they have spoken about Jewish casualties. They have spoken about that terrorist atrocity. Not his words, but they've spoken about it. And this gets into a difficult situation journalists face when covering this. Now, I'm still very critical of the way the BBC refuses to call Hamas a terrorist organisation. But I've also seen a claim from Israelis and Israel supporters that there's a huge bias against Israel. I don't think that is accurate at all. I mean, I think they're taking the mentality that any reporting from the Palestinian side is therefore pro-Hamas. I utterly disagree with that, and I think it's very unfair and just plain wrong. Of course, journalists have to report from the Palestinian side or try to report what is going on there, that Israeli airstrikes are killing people. It's a horrible situation. I guess what Bennett's saying is we're fighting against Nazis. How can I don't think they should compromise with Hamas. I don't think it's a question of, you know, treat them like a standing army, because they're not. But the problem with carpet bombing the area, the problem with cutting off power supplies, the problem with all those sort of absolute policies is it won't necessarily help the hostages. And it will damage Israel's reputation in the court of public appeal, or the court of public opinion, which I think is a problem, because I think Israel is facing its darkest hour. So Israel needs to be smart about this. Angry, vengeful, yes, but also smart. And as a supporter of Israel, I'm concerned that the more Palestinians who will die, the more that support will ebb away. And I know that puts me in a slightly strange position, because this is something that ignites very strong views. There's either people who are smack bang in the middle, there's people who are absolutely with the Palestinians, and there are people who are absolutely with the Israelis. I'm more with the Israeli side, but I don't blindly say Israel can do whatever it wants. I am uneasy about its scorched earth policy here. I think it can backfire seriously. Also, Israel needs to remember that the people it's sort of saying don't lecture us on moral grounds are often the countries that are supporting it militarily. I mean, the United States has given extensive aid to Israel, and they know that. And frankly, they should be grateful for it. Um, I'm a supporter of Israel, but I think that they need to understand that this will be a media war as much as anything. And, you know, when men, women, and children are slaughtered en masse, when Israeli babies are slaughtered, obviously emotions are going to be running very, very high. But there's also been children killed on the Palestinian side. And I do basically agree with the principle that an Israeli civilian and a Palestinian civilian should be on par. And I think there is a perception that people think there's more concern about Israeli civilians. I think there is a perception of that. So, you know, there's no easy answers here. I think there will have to be a ground invasion. I hope Hamas is eliminated. I think they are poison. I hope their leadership is killed. Not because I take any pleasure from death, but because I think they're a massive threat to the whole region. But I do think Israel has an obligation to provide some sort of humanitarian corridor. This argument that they are our enemies, I mean, Bennett was saying that they hide behind civilians, but he wasn't differentiating between Hamas and the Palestinian civilians. That's a big problem. And I think for many, even supporters of Israel would be a little bit uneasy about that, because they wouldn't go with that. They wouldn't say, well, you know, it may well be the case that Hamas is hiding behind civilians. In fact, there's no may well be about it. That's what they're doing. But if Israel is taking the attitude, well, everyone in the Gaza Strip is our enemy, including children, including old people, it's going to damage Israel's reputation. Now, I'm a supporter of Israel, but I will not blindly support without question the deaths of civilians when it is preventable. You know, an aerial bombardment, I know that it takes time to plan up a ground invasion. It's very complex. There's a lot of logistics involved in that. So, you know, the bombing thing is probably, for frankly, psychological warfare. But I think at this point, they should stop it and focus on the ground invasion. I support a ground invasion because I think Hamas needs to be taken out. I do not expect Israel to negotiate with Hamas. In terms of the hostages, someone on my, excuse me, I read the comment like 10 minutes ago, but I can't remember my subscriber. It was either Sloth Jolly or, please excuse me, I can't remember off the top of my head, but someone made the very valid point that, or the very plausible point that the hostages are actually already dead. I think maybe initially Hamas held them thinking they can use them for prisoner exchange, but maybe when the bombings intensified, then the hostages were killed, in which case that was a very foolish move by Israel. I don't really know what the objective of that was, other than maybe psychological warfare. Maybe their idea was it was to terrorize Hamas into handing over the hostages, but some of the hostages may have been killed. But I don't expect Israel to negotiate with a death cult that wants its very existence, you know, taken off the face of the earth. But I think that interview with Bennett, I think Bennett handled it badly. I'm not saying he shouldn't have any emotions, but I think he should have calmly said, well, Hamas hide behind civilians and we're trying to minimize it. But he didn't say that. He just got onto the defensive and kept interrupting and pigeonholing the journalist as something he wasn't. I think that was unfair. And it shows the difficulty of covering a war like this for journalists. Because if they question Israeli ministers, Israelis will say, oh, you're sympathizing with terrorists, which is utterly wrong. And if they if they support Israel in any way, if they cover the terrorist carnage in Israel, then they're accused of, disregarding Palestinian casualties. So this is a sort of war where it's very, very difficult for a journalist to cover. I still think the BBC is wrong in their editorial position on calling Hamas terrorists, but if Israel expects the BBC and CNN and other networks to just have no coverage of the Palestinian side, that is utterly unreasonable. Even during World War II, there was reporting on, I'm not saying American and British reporters were reporting from the German side, but in any war there is two sides. This is not to say it's a level playing field. It's not to say that, you have a standing army against a terrorist organization. Certainly Hamas don't differentiate between Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers. I get that. But Israel can't reduce itself to the levels of a terrorist organization. That's the point. So tonight I've got very mixed feelings. I look at what's happening with, the increase with attacks on synagogues, graffiti on Jewish cemeteries. I think Jews understandably feel very threatened. And I think the principle of Israel having to respond to this, I hope they take out Hamas once and for all, is very, very important. But I will not apologise for saying that I am uneasy when I see images of Palestinian children brought from ruins. Yes, it's a war that Hamas ignited. Yes, they hide behind civilians. But Israel really has no reason not to provide some sort of humanitarian corridor, or at least allow aid in. Bennett was saying if you want to come in and give them aid, do so. Well, he's not being very honest with that, because Israel won't entirely let that happen. So that is something I take issue with on the Israeli side. But, I saw an interview with a man earlier who actually praised the fact that his daughter had been murdered, because he said it was better than being a hostage in Gaza. Emotions are running very, very high. But I kind of think Israel's now taking an approach of, we don't really care if we have support or not. This is total war. We're fighting for our existence, and that is it. That's a mistake. They should be looking at the strategy that President Zelensky is using in Ukraine. That is to say, basically, get international opinion on your side. Zelensky has made emotional pitches to leaders and governments around the world. I think it's largely been effective. Israel should do the same, focus on the fact that they're fighting for their survival, but not imply that they are dehumanizing the Palestinians as a whole and not differentiating between Hamas and civilians. I think that's a mistake, and it will go against Israel, because it is a very grim situation in Gaza. Yes, Israelis are facing constant rocket threats, and his very existence is questioned, but no one can honestly deny that the situation in Gaza is grim. I believe a big part of that is down to Hamas's decisions. I believe Hamas has brought a lot of the misery in that area, but Israel is not helping. And, the more Palestinians who die, the harder it's going to be for people who have basic sense of right and wrong to continue to blindly support Israel no matter what. I support Israel in a ground invasion, in taking out Hamas commanders, in basic self-defense, but that shouldn't extend to collective punishment. And I think the aerial bombardment at this point is going too far. They can set selective targets, but they know full well that civilians will die. That is one thing I'm uneasy about, and it's one area where I will not blindly support Israel, because I think there are other options. Let me know your thoughts.